My in-laws forged my signature to evict me while I was giving birth. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I was bleeding, shivering, and holding my 2-day-old daughter when my mother-in-law smiled and locked my own front door in my face. The sharp, metallic click of the new heavy-duty deadbolt echoing in the freezing November air is a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. My surgical incision burned with a white-hot agony beneath my heavy winter coat, a physical reminder of the emergency C-section I had undergone less than 48 hours prior. I stood on the frosted concrete of my own front porch, my breath pluming in the icy air, staring at the brass door handle that refused to turn. My husband, David, the man who was supposed to be my partner and protector, stood silently in the shadowy foyer behind his mother. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. Barbara, a woman whose perfectly manicured exterior masked a deeply rotting core of entitlement, cracked the door open just 2 inches. The warm, familiar scent of my own home, cinnamon and cedarwood, drifted out, mocking my freezing reality. She didn't ask to hold her new granddaughter. She didn't ask if I was in pain. Instead, she slipped a crisp, stark white piece of legal paper through the narrow gap. It fluttered down and landed on the icy welcome mat at my feet. "It's a formal eviction notice, Clara," Barbara said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, terrifyingly calm venom. "You have zero legal right to be on this property anymore. I suggest you find a shelter before the baby freezes." The heavy mahogany door slammed shut, vibrating the porch beneath my boots. I bent down, ignoring the tearing sensation in my abdomen, and picked up the paper. It wasn't just a standard eviction warning. Attached to it was a notarized quitclaim deed, transferring the total ownership of my home directly to Barbara. At the bottom of the page, supposedly signed in my own handwriting, was my signature, but I had never signed it. The date stamped next to the ink was the exact day I gave birth, a day I spent entirely trapped within the sterile, terrifying walls of the hospital maternity ward. How does a woman sign away her greatest asset while fighting for her life on a surgical table? I stared at the forged legal paper, realizing my family had just declared war. To understand the sheer, calculated cruelty of this betrayal, you have to understand exactly what that house meant to me. It wasn't just a building. It was my armor against a chaotic world. I bought that 3-bedroom Craftsman entirely on my own at 25, using the brutal savings from years of working double shifts and aggressively budgeting every single penny. The deed was exclusively in my name, a premarital asset protected by hard legal boundaries before I ever met David. I like structural logic. I like the undeniable truth of a signed contract and a paid-off mortgage. When David and I started dating, he seemed to admire my fierce independence, but his mother, Barbara, viewed it as a direct, unforgivable insult to her matriarchal authority. From the moment she first stepped onto my property, her eyes darted around like a predator sizing up a fresh kill. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about how real families share their wealth and how a wife shouldn't hold financial secrets from her husband. She hated that I didn't need David to survive. She hated that she couldn't use money to control me, a tactic she had weaponized against her own children for decades. As our wedding approached, Barbara aggressively pushed for a joint title, suggesting David deserved equal equity simply for existing in my space. I firmly refused, keeping my asset legally isolated. David shrugged it off, claiming his mother was just old-fashioned, but the resentment in Barbara's eyes only darkened. She began measuring my rooms when she thought I wasn't looking, bringing over hideous antique furniture, attempting to slowly mark her territory. I thought I was simply dealing with an overbearing, annoying mother-in-law who needed strict boundaries. I entirely underestimated the depth of her toxic, covetous obsession with my property. I believed my legal paperwork was an impenetrable fortress, failing to realize that predators don't respect locked doors. I should have known the moment she first saw my house that a countdown had silently begun. She smiled tightly at the deed, already calculating how to rip it from my hands. The erosion of my marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing drain of affection and presence, entirely orchestrated by Barbara. As soon as I became pregnant, the dynamic shifted with terrifying speed. Instead of drawing closer to me, David began to pull away, tethered to his mother by invisible, unbreakable strings of manipulation. Whenever we had a minor disagreement about nursery colors or budgeting for baby supplies, he would immediately flee to Barbara's house. He would return hours later, completely cold and regurgitating her toxic talking points word for word. "My mother thinks you're being incredibly selfish about the finances," he would say, staring blankly at the wall instead of looking at his pregnant wife. My home, once a sanctuary of peace, began to feel like a haunted house where I was the only living resident. I was practically a single mother long before my daughter even took her first breath. As my belly swelled, my physical exhaustion grew, making it harder to fight back against the creeping shadows of their emotional abandonment. David started taking mysterious, hushed phone calls in the garage. Bank statements for his personal accounts stopped coming to the house. When I questioned him, he would launch into defensive, gaslighting tirades, accusing me of being paranoid and stressed due to the pregnancy hormones. I was desperately trying to build a safe nest for our child, while he was systematically dismantling the very foundation of our partnership. Barbara began showing up unannounced, letting herself in with a spare key David had secretly given her, critically inspecting my cleaning habits and treating me less like a family member and more like a temporary incubator. The structural logic of my life was actively failing, replaced by a suffocating fog of isolation and unspoken threats. I spent my third trimester crying alone in the dark, feeling the cold draft of a deeply broken home. I was completely alone in my marriage, entirely unaware of the trap being actively set. The physical trauma started 3 weeks before my actual due date. It was a freezing Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the kitchen, organizing a stack of medical paperwork, when a sharp, tearing pain violently ripped through my lower back, followed instantly by the rush of my water breaking. Panic seized my chest. I grabbed my phone with trembling, sweaty hands and immediately dialed David's number. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I tried his office, only to be coldly informed by a receptionist that he had left hours ago for a family emergency. A terrifying sense of dread washed over me. I was entirely alone, paralyzed by escalating contractions that felt like heavy iron bands tightening around my spine. 10 agonizing minutes later, the front door violently swung open. It wasn't David. It was Barbara. She stood in the doorway wearing an immaculate wool coat, perfectly calm, as if she had been waiting down the street for exactly this moment. "David's phone is broken. I'm taking you to the hospital now," she commanded, her voice devoid of any warmth or maternal panic. I was in too much physical agony to argue or question the incredibly suspicious timing of her arrival. She grabbed my hospital bag and practically dragged me out to her pristine luxury sedan. The car ride was a suffocating nightmare. The leather seats were freezing, and the silence in the vehicle was heavy, oppressive, and entirely unnatural. Every time I cried out in pain, Barbara simply stared straight ahead at the road, her jaw tightly clenched. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. She was driving me toward the maternity ward with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a butcher delivering livestock to a slaughterhouse. My instincts screamed that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, but the blinding pain of labor overrode my logical mind. I was entirely at her mercy, physically incapacitated and rapidly losing control of my own bodily autonomy. The sterile, terrifying smell of the hospital hit my lungs as the real nightmare began. The maternity ward was a chaotic blur of stark white fluorescent lights, the sharp scent of iodine, and the relentless, rhythmic beeping of fetal heart monitors. Nurses swarmed around me, efficiently stripping off my clothes and hooking up heavy 4 lines to my trembling arms. The pain had escalated to a blinding, white-hot intensity, completely fragmenting my sense of time and reality. Through the agonizing haze, I desperately looked around for my husband. "Where is David?" I gasped, grabbing a nurse's sleeve. Before she could answer, Barbara stepped out of the shadows of the corner of the room. She was holding a brown medical clipboard, her eyes scanning the chaotic scene with an unsettling, predatory focus. "He's stuck in severe traffic, Clara. Just focus on breathing," she lied smoothly, her voice cutting through the noise like a cold razor blade. Suddenly, the relentless beeping of the fetal monitor drastically changed pitch, dropping into a terrifyingly slow, hollow rhythm. The entire atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from routine urgency to absolute, raw panic. The attending doctor rushed in, his face grim and pale. The baby's heart rate is plummeting. We have severe fetal distress. We need to move to an emergency C-section right now, he barked, pointing at the surgical team. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded my veins. I was physically strapped to the rolling bed, my body convulsing with fear and uncontrollable pain. As the nurses aggressively pushed my bed toward the heavy double doors of the operating theater, I caught one final glimpse of my mother-in-law. Barbara wasn't looking at me with concern or fear for her grandchild. She was looking at the chaotic distraction with a sickening, calculated satisfaction, her fingers tightly gripping that mysterious brown clipboard. She had the exact expression of a thief watching the bank vault door finally swing open. I watched her smile as the heavy doors swung open and the surgical lights blinded me. The operating theater was a freezing, terrifyingly bright cavern of stainless steel and sharp instruments. My body violently shook from the adrenaline and the freezing temperature of the room. The anesthesiologist, a tired-looking man with kind eyes, quickly attempted to administer the epidural into my spine, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The pain was too intense. My muscles were locked in a rigid, defensive spasm. "The block isn't taking, doctor," the anesthesiologist called out urgently over the chaotic noise of the surgical prep. "We don't have time. The baby is crashing. We have to put her under general anesthesia immediately," the lead surgeon commanded. A heavy, clear plastic mask was slammed over my nose and mouth. The taste of the medical gas was sharp, metallic, and incredibly bitter on my tongue. "Count back from 10, Clara," a distant voice instructed. My eyelids suddenly felt like they were made of heavy lead. 9, 8. As the paralyzing darkness began to drag me under, the heavy doors of the operating room briefly swung open. Through my fading, blurry vision, I saw Barbara step into the sterile corridor, entirely violating hospital protocol. But she wasn't alone. Standing right beside her, holding a thick leather briefcase, was her brother, Uncle Greg. Greg was a sleazy, morally bankrupt man who worked as a licensed public notary, infamous in our family for bending legal rules for cash. Why was a notary standing outside my emergency surgery? My oxygen-deprived brain struggled to connect the terrifying dots. 7, 6. Barbara pointed directly at my unconscious body, handing Greg the brown clipboard. He pulled out a heavy metal notary stamp. The horrifying realization of their scheme struck me like a physical blow, but my vocal cords were already entirely paralyzed by the powerful drugs. The cold, dark void completely swallowed me before I could scream for someone to stop them. I woke up to the sensation of coarse hospital blankets and a dull, throbbing agony radiating from my deeply sliced abdomen. The harsh fluorescent lights burned my retinas as I forced my eyes open. A tiny, warm weight was resting gently on my chest. My daughter. She was breathing perfectly, wrapped tightly in a striped hospital blanket. The profound, crushing relief made me violently sob, the physical movement sending sharp spikes of pain through my fresh stitches. I weakly turned my head. David was finally there, sitting entirely slouched in a plastic visitor's chair. He wasn't looking at his beautiful newborn daughter. He was obsessively staring down at his phone, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He looked incredibly guilty. Before I could even ask him where he had been during the most terrifying moment of my life, Barbara suddenly bustled into the recovery room. She was unervingly cheerful, practically vibrating with a dark, triumphant energy. "Oh, thank goodness you're awake, Clara. We were so worried," she lied, her voice dripping with fake, sugary sympathy. "The nurses say you can be discharged this afternoon if your vitals remain stable." My vision was still incredibly blurry from the heavy lingering effects of the general anesthesia, and my prescription glasses were nowhere to be found. A nurse entered the room carrying a thick stack of standard discharge paperwork. "Just need a few signatures here, honey, so we can get you out of this bed and back home," the nurse said kindly, placing a pen into my shaking, exhausted hand. Barbara immediately leaned over my bed, her eyes fixed sharply on the tip of the pen. "Just sign where the sticky flags are, Clara. It's just routine hospital release forms," Barbara urged, her voice tight with suppressed anxiety. Exhausted, heavily medicated, and desperate to escape the sterile prison, I didn't question it. I signed the blurred papers, unknowingly sealing the trap that had already violently snapped shut. The drive back to my house was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Every bump in the asphalt sent a searing wave of fiery pain through my stapled abdomen. David drove with a stiff, terrifying rigidity, his knuckles completely white on the steering wheel, refusing to make eye contact via the rearview mirror. I held my fragile daughter tightly against my chest, desperate to finally walk through my own front door, collapse into my own bed, and try to salvage the shattered pieces of my family. We pulled into my concrete driveway. The house looked exactly the same, yet the atmosphere felt dangerously wrong. David didn't turn off the engine. "Go ahead, I'll grab the bags," he muttered, staring blankly at the dashboard. I slowly, painfully pushed myself out of the passenger seat, clutching the baby to my chest, and painfully hobbled up the front porch stairs. I dug my keys out of my heavy winter coat, my fingers shaking from the biting wind, and slid the familiar brass key into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. I tried forcing it, jiggling the metal, but the internal mechanism was completely different. The lock had been professionally changed. Before the panic could fully register in my exhausted brain, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Barbara stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was set in a cold, ruthless mask of absolute victory. That was the exact moment she handed me the stark white eviction notice and the notarized quitclaim deed. I read my own forged signature, dated the exact day of my surgery. "You don't live here anymore, Clara," Barbara stated flatly, her eyes totally devoid of human empathy. I frantically looked back at the idling car. David slowly stepped out, walking up the driveway, and deliberately stood behind his mother. He chose his side. I stood entirely abandoned in the freezing cold, clutching my newborn as my world completely shattered. The sheer, paralyzing shock of the betrayal physically forced the breath from my lungs. I was bleeding heavily into a massive postpartum pad, shivering violently in the freezing wind, entirely locked out of the home I had sacrificed years of my youth to purchase. With David hiding like a pathetic coward behind his mother's skirt, I had absolutely no choice but to retreat. I painfully staggered away from my own porch, hailed a passing cab, and directed the driver to a cheap, gritty motel located 2 towns over. The room smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. I sat on the edge of the sagging, floral-patterned mattress, clutching my peacefully sleeping daughter, and finally let the agonizing, guttural sobs rip through my throat. I had been completely robbed of my safe haven, my marriage, and my financial stability in a single, calculated strike. But as the blinding tears finally began to slow, a different emotion entirely hijacked my nervous system. The despair rapidly crystallized into a cold, terrifying, and razor-sharp rage. I am not a victim. I am a survivor who deeply understands structural logic. If they wanted a legal war, I was going to give them a bloodbath. I picked up my cell phone and immediately called my fiercely loyal best friend, Sarah. Sarah wasn't just my closest confidant. She was a highly aggressive, brilliant family law attorney who thrived on destroying toxic abusers in the courtroom. I quickly explained the changed locks, the terrifying hospital memory of Uncle Greg, and the forged quitclaim deed Barbara had shoved in my face. Sarah didn't offer empty sympathies. She simply asked for the exact spelling of Uncle Greg's legal name. "Stay in that room, Clara. Do not text David. Do not engage," Sarah commanded, her voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal register. I wiped my tears, knowing I was about to meticulously dismantle their lives piece by piece. Sarah arrived at my depressing motel room exactly 2 hours later, carrying a heavy leather briefcase, an extra-large black coffee, and a massive stack of freshly printed legal documents. She had aggressively pulled all the recent property records filed with the county clerk's office, bypassing the usual waiting periods through her professional connections. We spread the heavily stapled papers out across the cheap, sticky laminate surface of the small motel desk, the harsh overhead light illuminating their horrific crime. Right on top was the official, recorded copy of the fraudulent quitclaim deed that legally stripped my home from my possession. I leaned in closely, ignoring the burning pain in my abdomen, and examined the signature. It was a terrifyingly good forgery, clearly traced from a previous document they had likely stolen from my home office, but it lacked the natural, fluid pressure of my actual handwriting. Barbara isn't just cruel. She's a complete, arrogant idiot, Sarah muttered darkly, her eyes narrowing with intense focus as she tapped her manicured fingernail against the bottom right corner of the document. Look at the notary's seal, Clara. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. Uncle Greg's official state notary stamp was pressed firmly onto the thick paper, legally binding the fraudulent transaction. But it was the tiny, handwritten details right beneath the heavy black ink stamp that made my heart violently pound. In our state, a public notary is legally required to log the exact time and date a signature is witnessed to prevent precisely this type of calculated fraud. Greg had confidently scribbled the date of my delivery, followed by a highly specific, undeniable time, 2:14 p.m. A cold, predatory smile slowly spread across my exhausted face. At 2:14 p.m. on that specific Tuesday, I was not sitting in a room signing property transfers. I was strapped to a freezing surgical table, heavily medicated and fighting for my life. The arrogant idiots had formally documented their own massive felony with absolute, undeniable precision. We stared at the tiny ink numbers, realizing they had just handed us the murder weapon. The beauty of structural logic is that it relies entirely on cold, hard facts that cannot be manipulated by gaslighting or emotional abuse. The very next morning, running on exactly 2 hours of sleep and pure, unadulterated vengeance, I called the hospital's medical records department. As the patient, I had immediate, unquestionable legal right to my entire medical file. I specifically requested the highly detailed anesthesia logs and the minute-by-minute surgical timeline from my emergency C-section. 2 days later, a thick, secure digital file landed in Sarah's encrypted email inbox. We sat at her polished dining room table, opening the massive PDF document. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense columns of medical jargon, heart rate data, and heavy medication dosages, hunting for the exact time frame of the forgery. There it was. The official surgical timeline, verified by 3 separate attending physicians. At exactly 2:05 p.m., the anesthesiologist formally noted the failure of the spinal block. At 2:08 p.m., the administration of general anesthesia was strictly logged. And at precisely 2:14 p.m., the exact same minute Uncle Greg swore under penalty of perjury that he watched me physically sign away my house. My medical chart proved I was entirely unconscious, legally incapacitated, and physically intubated with a plastic breathing tube shoved down my throat. You physically cannot sign a binding legal contract while you are in a medically induced coma undergoing major abdominal surgery. The paper trail was absolutely flawless, heavily documented by unbiased medical professionals, and completely devastating to their pathetic scheme. Barbara thought she could steal my home while I was trapped in the vulnerable darkness of anesthesia, never suspecting that the hospital's meticulous record-keeping would become my ultimate weapon. They had trapped themselves in a massive, easily provable lie. My airtight alibi was permanently etched into a highly secure, undeniable federal medical database. The easiest thing to do would have been to immediately call the local police, hand them the hospital records, and watch my toxic in-laws get aggressively arrested in their pajamas. But Sarah and I wanted something far more permanent and entirely devastating. If we just called the cops, Barbara would immediately claim it was a simple administrative error, or David would hire a sleazy, expensive lawyer to drag the civil case through the courts for years while they comfortably lived in my beautiful house. We needed them to confidently commit perjury on a recorded legal transcript. We needed to trigger the trap in a highly controlled environment where they could not escape their own disgusting lies. Sarah drafted a highly formal, incredibly polite email to David and Barbara, requesting an official legal mediation session at her downtown law office. The premise of the meeting was entirely fake. Sarah claimed that I was completely broken, deeply terrified of a lengthy legal battle, and simply wanted to negotiate a small financial move-out settlement in exchange for quietly surrendering the property forever. The bait was utterly irresistible to a greedy narcissist like Barbara. The idea that she had completely crushed my spirit and officially won the war was a high she couldn't possibly refuse. Within an hour, David aggressively replied, smugly agreeing to the meeting and stating that they would proudly bring their notary, Uncle Greg, to verify the absolute legality of the existing documents. It took every ounce of my agonizing postpartum self-control not to scream with dark, triumphant laughter. They were bringing the corrupt notary directly into the ambush. I spent the next 2 days meticulously organizing the hospital medical files, ensuring every timestamp was heavily highlighted in bright yellow ink. The trap was set with terrifying precision. We were building an inescapable legal slaughterhouse, and they were walking right into it. The heavy mahogany conference table in Sarah's downtown law office was cold, polished, and intimidating. I sat silently next to Sarah, holding a pen and maintaining a blank, completely defeated expression. Across the wide table sat my abusers, David, refusing to make eye contact, Uncle Greg, sweating slightly in a cheap suit, and Barbara, practically glowing with toxic, unearned victory. The court reporter sat quietly in the corner, her fingers hovering over the stenograph machine, ready to permanently record every single word. Sarah started the meeting with a calm, professional tone. "We are here to discuss the abrupt transfer of my client's premarital property. Barbara, for the official record, can you confirm how you acquired the deed?" Sarah asked softly. Barbara couldn't resist the opportunity to gloat on the record. She aggressively slid the forged quitclaim deed across the polished wood, tapping the signature line. "Clara willingly signed this over to me on the day she gave birth. She finally realized the financial burden was too much for her, and she wanted the property to remain securely in our family's name," Barbara stated smoothly, a sickeningly confident lie recorded forever. Sarah turned her sharp gaze to the sleazy notary. "And Greg, for the record, you physically witnessed Clara sign this document? You verified her identity and state of mind?" Greg puffed out his chest, nodding vigorously. "Absolutely. I was in the hospital room. Clara signed it at exactly 2:14 p.m., just like my official timestamp says. She was totally lucid." The court reporter typed rapidly, sealing their fate in permanent ink. The room fell entirely silent for a long, heavy moment. The arrogance radiating from their side of the table was thick and suffocating. Barbara leaned back in her expensive leather chair, crossing her arms in pure triumph. She smiled, entirely oblivious to the explosive trap resting directly under her perfectly manicured hands. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy, brightly tabbed folder containing my verified hospital surgical logs. She slowly, deliberately slid the heavy folder across the mahogany table until it bumped directly against the forged quitclaim deed. "That is an incredibly fascinating story, Greg," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "Because according to Clara's securely verified federal medical records, at exactly 2:14 p.m., she was completely unconscious under general anesthesia, actively undergoing an emergency C-section, with a heavy plastic breathing tube shoved entirely down her trachea." The color violently drained from Barbara's face, turning her skin a sickening, ashen gray. Uncle Greg physically gasped, staring at the brightly highlighted medical timestamps as if they were venomous snakes. This is fake," David stammered weakly, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "No, David, it's highly certified medical evidence," Sarah countered sharply, leaning aggressively over the table. "What we have here on the official transcript is a highly documented conspiracy to commit severe real estate fraud, federal wire fraud, and aggravated perjury. Greg, your notary license is permanently gone, and you are facing serious prison time. Barbara, you orchestrated the entire theft. And David, your absolute complicity makes you a prime accessory." The arrogant, triumphant masks they had worn just moments ago completely shattered, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. Uncle Greg started violently shaking, instantly pointing a trembling finger at Barbara. "She made me do it. She swore Clara agreed to it," he screamed in panic. David buried his face in his hands, aggressively sobbing and begging me for mercy, claiming he was just confused and manipulated by his mother. I looked at the man I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but cold disgust. The silence in the room was the sound of 3 entire lives being instantly destroyed. The aftermath of the mediation ambush was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. Sarah didn't hesitate for a single second. She immediately filed an emergency judicial injunction, presenting the damning medical timestamps to a deeply furious judge. Within 24 hours, local law enforcement aggressively escorted Barbara and David off my property, forcing them onto the cold sidewalk with only the clothes on their backs. The fraudulent deed was officially voided, and severe criminal arrest warrants were immediately issued for both Barbara and her corrupt brother, Greg, for heavy real estate fraud and perjury. David was hit with devastating divorce papers that entirely stripped him of any claim to my assets or any unsupervised custody of our daughter. His cowardly compliance had cost him absolutely everything he claimed to value. Moving back into my beautiful, quiet house was a profoundly emotional experience. I had the locks changed once again, replacing the hardware with heavy-duty, smart-enabled deadbolts that only I controlled. The sterile smell of the hospital and the gritty odor of the cheap motel were finally washed away, replaced once again by the warm scent of cedarwood and the soft, peaceful sounds of my newborn daughter. The intense trauma of that betrayal fundamentally changed my core architecture. I learned the hardest possible way that shared blood does not grant an automatic pass for horrific abuse, and that toxic entitlement will stop at absolutely nothing to feed its own greed. If you are ever faced with manipulative relatives who view your hard-earned stability as their personal property, you must respond with cold, calculated evidence and absolutely zero mercy. The world is full of emotional predators hiding behind the mask of family, but they cower when exposed to the blinding light of undeniable facts. I sit in my beautiful, freshly painted nursery today, holding my safe, sleeping daughter, entirely free from the toxic cancer of my past. I am the architect of my own safety, and my daughter will never know their shadows.